everyone. I'm Greg Beaman. I'm a first-year doctoral student in the history department at Georgetown University, and we're here today with Professor Jamie Martin. Professor Martin is an assistant professor of history at Georgetown. His research focuses on the history of capitalism, modern Europe, and international order. His current book project is called Governing Global Capitalism in the Era of Total War, under advanced contract at Harvard University Press, and it investigates the origins of the earliest international schemes to govern the world's capitalist economy, which emerged out of efforts to stabilize European political and economic orders in the aftermath of the First World War. His research also looks at the history of the social sciences, and his writings on political economy and European history for a public audience have appeared in the London Review of Books, The Nation, and Book Forum. Professor Martin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'd like to start on a very basic level. Why did you become a historian?
It's a good question. It's always difficult to answer these questions with hindsight, but I think that I wanted to become a historian at a fairly young age, though I don't think I actually knew precisely what historians did. History in high school was certainly my favorite topic, and I think it was because as a historian it seemed as though you could answer a lot of different questions. You could talk about religion, you could talk about economics, you could talk about philosophy. You didn't have to kind of sequester yourself into one particular discipline. You could talk about anything provided that it happened in the past, at least so it seemed to me. When I was an undergraduate, I majored in philosophy largely because the philosophy major at Yale, where I was an undergraduate, was very flexible and didn't have many requirements. So I could kind of craft the major more into a kind of an intellectual history major than a straight up philosophy major. When I started my PhD, I thought I was going to continue working in intellectual history, kind of specifically defined, but really at that time, I and some of my peers began to kind of veer out of intellectual history, and really I think it was the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, we all really, I think, wanted to understand how this had happened, what it meant, and what the kind of deep historical explanations of it could be. So a lot of us turned to political economy, and not just the history of economic thought, the history of institutions, economic history itself, economic processes. And once that began to crystallize for me, I think that the kind of particular nature of my research took shape. But I guess that's kind of perhaps an encouraging story for first-year graduate students. I did not know what I wanted to do in the first year of my PhD. It took some time to kind of discover myself and my interests and then to shape the research topic. So it's okay if you don't know yet.
Very nice. You mentioned some similar interests you share with your colleagues, and I noticed reviewing your work that you have a chapter in the Cambridge History of the Second World War that you co-authored with Adam Tooze. What are some of the challenges of collaboration, and how did you overcome those challenges?
Well, it was wonderful to collaborate with Adam Tooze. Adam Tooze was, of course, a huge inspiration for my own work. The collaboration, I mean, it went very smoothly for us. I think when you collaborate with someone, you can't be precious about your own writing. You have to be willing to have someone even just go in and delete your sentences, or to suggest ways of reframing things, or to get rid of excess words in one place or the other. The nature of the collaboration between us was facilitated, I think, by each of us kind of, well, in the case of my contribution, to really sticking to the topics that I knew best, the history of the Bretton Woods settlement, some of the international negotiations over economic policy that occurred, and Adam Tooze stuck more to the kind of nitty-gritty questions of the war economies, of the Nazi war economy and the Allied war economy. So that made it easy. But you know, collaboration is a wonderful challenge that I certainly encourage all of you to do it. But you can't go in, you know, expecting that every single sentence you write is going to make it into the final draft, because it just will be impossible if you have that expectation.
Right on, right. Thank you. So you shared with us a chapter from your upcoming book project, Governing Global Capitalism in the Era of Total War. Can you describe the larger book project from which that chapter is taken?
Sure. I should specify, though, that what I submitted for you was actually a standalone article, though it borrows from two different chapters from the book and trying to kind of put it into a larger perspective. The book project itself, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, is a history of the very first international attempts to govern the world economy, which I argued really began to emerge in the late 19th century and then emerged with accelerating speed during the period of the world wars in Europe. There's a kind of a common view that when you think of the history of international economic governance, you naturally think of the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944. You think of the end of the Second World War and the US kind of arriving triumphantly onto the scene, creating the World Bank, creating the IMF. What I argue is that we shouldn't think of the Bretton Woods moment as a kind of origin story. Really, we should see it as a midpoint in a much longer history that extends back into the 19th century and that, of course, continues up to this day. So in kind of broad outline, that's the shape of the book, the kind of the intervention, broadly speaking. But the actors of the book are, broadly speaking, European, though not exclusively. Some of the work focuses on colonial Malaya, for example, India, China, and towards the end of the book, there's a heavy focus on the United States as well.
Okay. So digging a little bit more into that, are we in a state of total war right now? Or how would you describe total war? And how, is this radically different than situations we saw in the past where we come out of the imperial era, the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries into the 19th when imperialism is dominant and we think of wars as characterizing imperial rivalries. How would the situation as you see it in the 19th to 20th century radically different from the past?
Well, I would say first off that thankfully we're not in an era of total war now. Though that doesn't mean that we won't be in the future, though I hope we won't be. I think it's very difficult actually to analogize our current moment to past historical eras. I think it's very popular right now to kind of throw out different analogies. So some people think that we're going through this period right now that looks a lot like Europe before the First World War. It's a kind of a multipolar world. There is competition between the great powers. There are few or only weak international institutions, and we may be kind of hurtling forward into some kind of major conflagration. Other people seem to think of the interwar period as the obvious analogy. We have democratic retrenchment, the rise of extremist political parties, general international instability. I think the new metaphor, or the new analogy that many people are using is the Cold War, right? It seems as though we seem to be entering some kind of era of bipolar competition with another great power. The world may be in the process of splitting up into blocs again. These analogies are all fine, I think, insofar as they go, but I don't think any of them offer a complete picture. And I also think it's extremely difficult while you're living through a historical era to fully understand the shape of it. That is, in part, the kind of the classic move by the historian to not take responsibility for analyzing the current moment. But I do think we have to be careful because the kind of historical analogies we use can shape the kind of policies that we think are important. So part of my work is to, I want to be part of the kind of contemporary conversation, and I strive to be part of the contemporary conversation, but part of the work is to kind of put the brakes on some of the analogies as they come out rough and ready. But also to suggest, how we got here, how our current moment is the product of all of these different moments, not exactly analogous to any of them, however.
Okay. So the theme of our session this week is history through things, and we've talked a good deal about culture and interiors in a more conventional material culture sense. Your work, the one that you shared with us, is no less concerned with things, but you discuss raw materials and glut and how these things play on a global stage. Can you discuss any particular conception of material culture that maybe you had in the back of your mind as you were approaching this, since it's not really a conventional cultural or artistic thing that we're discussing?
Sure.
But it is nonetheless a thing. Could you expound a little bit on how you approached those things?
One of the themes of my work in general, and particularly in this article, is how politics and policymaking are constrained by material realities, shaped and constrained by material realities, whether this is in the nature of industrial production, the extraction of raw materials, how goods are moved across water or across land, how food is produced and consumed, so on and so forth. I think this kind of focus would be second nature to an economic historian, broadly speaking. You know, you can't understand the history of economic growth without looking at particular commodity regimes. You can't understand the history of trade, and so on and so forth. I think, however, that when it comes to economic policy making, in particular, the history of international economic policy making, historians tend to focus more on more abstract questions about monetary problems, finance, or trade in the abstract, whether trade is open, whether states are protectionist. One of the interventions of this piece is to say we actually have to look at precisely what's being traded, how goods are extracted, how goods are marketed, and how economic policy regimes emerge and are shaped by the very specific nature of the extraction and marketing of goods, not only of the kind of big classic goods like oil or coal or wheat, but also zinc, tin, chrome, these kinds of things that don't always spring to mind when we think of the history of commodities.
So this is certainly very much concerned with culture, in that there are people who are actually doing these extractions, and the culture of their work and the job and the way that we all shape our lives as a result of those things. Coming back to a little bit about your career as a historian, before you came to Georgetown, you were the ARC Postdoctoral Research Fellow in the Laureate Research Program in International History at the University of Sydney. Could you talk a little bit about how you got to that point? Their research theme is inventing the international, something, of course, that you're very concerned with in your work. How did you find that post, and then how did working there shape the work that you do?
Yeah, well, the University of Sydney was an absolutely wonderful place to be. Highly recommend it if any of you have any reason to be there. The particular nature of this project was extremely well suited to my research interests because it was led by an Australian historian, Glenda Sluga, who really was trying to bring together international historians and people who work broadly in what we might call economic history. Now, in the past, diplomatic historians and economic historians, I think, used to speak to each other more naturally. A kind of history of economic diplomacy used to be a thriving field. It isn't really so much anymore. But what Glenda Sluga was attempting to do was to really kind of carve out this niche where international historians, who once might have focused more on, say, international law or the history of human rights or refugees, could now really kind of wade back into the economic field. And this was also certainly one of the interventions of my own work and the things I was attempting to accomplish with my research. So it was a very comfortable place to be. It was also an exciting place because there was kind of, you know, we were trying to shape a field as it was emerging or as it was re-emerging. So we hosted several conferences there, and Australia is a place where, while it's very far away, people do like to go there for conferences, particularly when the weather's nice. So it was an absolutely fantastic experience.
Thank you. So in terms of this emerging field that you're discussing, and this trend towards internationalism that I think has, of course, characterized a lot of historical writing in the last 10 or 20 years and even longer, where do you see your work going out of this, and how have you tried to capitalize on that trend as a historian?
So, as I was saying, as I began my research, as I kind of began to think about political economy as the kind of field that I was most interested in, the international question presented itself very obviously, in part because so many of my colleagues were exploring the history of internationalism, the history of international institutions, and my work really developed in conversation with them. At the dissertation level, the project really focused a lot on the League of Nations, on international organizations as such. But as the book is developing and as I'm developing work for the second book project, I'm moving partially away from the kind of high intergovernmental organizations and really looking as well at how financial institutions, industrial cartels, kind of hybrid private-public institutions also performed these governing functions on the international level, and how they existed in kind of productive tension with the kind of higher, more formal public international organizations. So I think that's one kind of possible future for the field, looking at how private institutions as well as public institutions kind of develop international governing powers and exercise those powers.
Is this a theme you see in other work, or is this something you're trying to use your own research to lead the field with?
I think that it's developing in other work as well. The second project that I'm working on right now is a history of sovereign debt in the 19th century, and really how financial institutions, empires, and then ultimately in the 20th century, international organizations all develop in tandem, in cooperation or in competition, particular regimes for managing sovereign debt on the international level. And this kind of work I do think other people are doing, looking at the intersection between private firms, financial bodies, government offices, colonial offices, international organizations. I think this is a kind of a productive path for the research going forward, not focusing simply on kind of one institutional site, but really at how institutions coordinate and meet over certain problems.
You've pointed out this distinction between the international bodies, the governmental bodies, and sort of the private bodies. And when we start to talk about things like sovereign debt, these are often held by private banks. How does this distinction break down the distinction between public and private in terms of international governance when it's a private entity that's holding a public entity accountable?
It's a great question. I mean, one of the problems you see with sovereign debt in the 19th century is that precisely because sovereign debt or the loans that are made by private individuals to sovereigns, this becomes a very tricky issue for international lawyers who at this time tend to think of international law as something that exists between two sovereign entities, not between private individuals and sovereign entities. So what happens when the state defaults? How do you protect the capital of these private individuals who lent their money to risky borrowers? It's a very, very difficult question to answer. Part of what happens in response is because this question is so hard to solve, you see recourse to military intervention. You see gunboats arriving to enforce debt claims. You see territorial acquisition or quasi-territorial acquisition, the expansion of European empire outwards. And only in the 20th century do you get international regimes for dealing with sovereign debt in ways that bypass or that don't require these more kind of military or the exertion of military or economic force upon debtor states. But this process of developing an international system for doing so is very fraught, precisely because, as you mentioned it, these contracts exist between sovereigns and individuals or private individuals.
I think there's a fascinating corollary to be made between debt collection through military action on a public scale and private scale that we maybe could get into at a different time. But in closing, I just want to ask you one more question about being a historian and the practical nature of being a historian. You're a prolific writer. You contribute to a number of publications. I mentioned them at the top of the interview. How do you choose your audience? How do you go out there and get your work placed in these publications?
It's a good question. I suppose I'd like to try to write pieces that are engaged with contemporary concerns, but that do so in a historical fashion, that don't try to necessarily provide a definitive interpretation of the current moment, that provide historical perspective, how we got to where we are, how we might think about where we are at the current moment. I think right now we're kind of going through a period of renaissance of journals, public journals that are interested in these kinds of questions, of places where people can review books, online fora, but also traditional print media. And I think that there is a kind of a hunger at the moment, in particular, for these kinds of pieces that provide some kind of way of framing this period of uncertainty and instability that we're experiencing in a broader historical lens.
Very nice. Professor Martin, thank you very much for coming today. This has been a very illuminating conversation. And let's all look out for Governing Global Capitalism in the Era of Total War, Professor Martin's forthcoming book with Harvard University Press.
Thank you very much.